Yeah.
You know, so it's very perverse, and it's perverse in a way that might not be perverse now, but then maybe we've gone through. We've moved through postmodern perversity, and we're out the other side. And
well, it's funny because talking about
would find it appalling, but it's a great novel.
Beyond Apollo is very. This, I think, it's 1972. I think it came out, and there's a lot of talk about the antiseptic nature of astronauts before that, and I think of. Have you ever read Jeb Mercury's novel Ascent?
No,
that's really good. And Jeb Mercury is somebody I see as intersecting with Ballard and with Malmesbury as well. But it's this whole.
Ballard? I can't remember.
Yeah,
I do like Ballard.
Yeah, he likes all the good stuff. No, all the good stuff. But it's that thing where, you know, we've these things were in their time, they were big news, and now they're virtually forgotten. And you know, Barry spent the last sort of 40 years as an obscure figure. Which
I mean, I'm not sure.
Weird.
I'm not sure what I think about this, because I mean, you're absolutely right. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm confused about whether Malmesbury is. Let's say there was to be, say, a resurgence of. I mean, I think. You lent me a copy of Guernica Night. My favourite novels are probably that for sure. Maybe of Malmesbury, Galaxies for sure. Beyond Apollo. I'm also a really big fan of Destruction of the Temple.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
And also I wonder though with his work whether, and I did teach a course that included Malmesbury in about 2016. Well, I'll put it this way, I feel like I'm ignorant of the climate, the sensitivities of the climate, whether those works would find themselves under the kind of the 21st century censorship of work that we see in academia and literature in general, where the way he writes, in the same way that Mailer has fallen flat, no one reads Mailer anymore. No. But they should, and he has a great new bunch of essays on democracy, really good, called A Mysterious Country. That Malmesbury's version of science fiction, what he did to it, I wonder whether it would be palatable at this point. Whether we've been through a postmodern period where there could have been a resurgence through the breakdown of physical, all the cliches about postmodernism and the boundaries of the body and permeability, but whether we're now back in a place where those things are true, but also there's a morality that would actually exclude this kind of science fiction that Malmesbury was doing at this point. Morality is the problem.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, you when you wrote your first novel, I, Judas, I think you might have mentioned in the introduction to Beyond Apollo that you wrote. It might have been elsewhere. I know we talked about this. You talked about how you were writing a novel about suicide.
Yeah.
And of course, Guernica Night is about a suicide cult. Yeah. And that was something in I, Judas, your first book.
And that came from. That actually started with. So that was the classic. Almost. I mean, maybe it's not. It isn't anymore. I was going to say it's a cliche. But it isn't, because no one reads Malmesbury, or practically no one reads Burroughs anymore. No. But that was the transition through those kind of, maybe modernist narratives, through the existentialists, through Burroughs, through others, and including, when you threw in Guernica Night, which were existential questions about the nature of suicide. And I think that's in this climate, knowing something of publishing and something of particularly the kind of slightly overweening literary web zine climate, writing about suicide is exceptionally difficult these days. Yeah. And I think when I was trying to write that, the important thing was, it was about the moral questions are still, they remain ambiguous, they remain unanswered. There's an ambivalence. I, Judas is about all of my stuff is about ambivalence, moral ambivalence. I don't know if we can hold on. I don't know if there is sufficient appetite, or even that's not even the right word, because that sounds like a commercial term. I don't know if ambivalence, the Fitzgerald thing of holding two contradictory ideas in the mind at the same time and not collapsing, has any currency these days.
Well,
Yeah,
I think that's the fundamental of literature, though.
Right.
I mean, if you, Borges certainly believed that a book should contain.
Oh, absolutely,
contradiction.
absolutely, yeah.
Because I think that's a great loss. People don't want to read that anymore.
I agree.
It's a huge loss.
It's how much moral ambivalence can you, or not even moral, existential ambivalence can you press into the novel, and it still be a novel that anybody will publish. That seems to be the dilemma for a lot of us who are writing these kind of ambivalent texts.
Well, I think there's a kind of self-righteousness at play at the moment that I don't even know where it is. It's certainly it's certainly in social media. People are very easily outraged, and there's also a mistaken notion that you can no longer write about other people's experience or other cultural experience.
Terrifying idea.
And yet, the fundamentals of fiction are imagining other people's experiences. And
Yeah.
I mean, for me, all my writing is an attempt to escape from myself, not like in an escapist way, but to try to see myself, beyond my own ego as being part as being
common humanity.
I mean, I'll
politics.
trash my own ideas as readily as I'll trash anything else in a novel. I mean, you've got to have the freedom to present ambiguity and evil, or
for sure, and also people that are not you. You know, in the sense of we've lived pretty well with the moral what would you call it, incitement, inducement to walk a mile in my shoes, and also now it's sort of at the same time walk a mile in my shoes, but also don't you dare presume to walk a mile in my shoes.
Yeah.
So there's that kind of imbalance that becomes, you could call that ambivalence, but the consequence of that inability, the sort of censorious culture that says, for example, I mean, I've written plenty of homosexual characters, and that's because of empathy. That's because of a certain amount of what would you call it even? Well, let's just call it just literary empathy, or I want the character to be such and such a person. I mean, I think to your point, it's offensive to me that someone should say that you shouldn't. Not even that you shouldn't, that you cannot, not even that you shouldn't, but you cannot do that.
I never pick up a book by a woman and think, oh, she's not writing about men very well, because I've never found that experience. If it's a well-written book by a woman, what you're saying, that all men are a certain way and all men aren't a certain way. It's how they create the individual characters.
Well, that's it. That's the fundamental problem, is because if I write a Scottish protagonist, say, right, the lazy critical assumption is that I'm writing about all Scottish protagonists, right? And fiction seems to me to be about the exceptions to the rule. So I don't need. It doesn't matter.
That comes like Trocky as an exception to the rule.
It doesn't matter whether my character is replicable once, twice, or 3,000 times. You read the novel because you're reading the individual and not reading the type.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's I guess in a long-winded way that we've been talking about. That's part of the issue, is that has tribalism, to the extent that it's taken over critical faculties, led to a point where we've lost the sense that any character is an individual. They're always representative of a tribal type. So, if I write a Scottish character that's inaccurate to your experience, or someone like me that's still inaccurate to my experience, there are 8 billion people in the world. You don't get to say that person can't exist, and the fact that they're unusual should be the reason to read them in fiction. But when I see a movie that's filmed at a frame rate that I can't perceive, that seems like sentimentality.
Yes.
That seems like an overweening attempt to make the film better.
Yeah.
I could watch World War I footage, World War II footage, at the frame rate. But if you want to film it at 300 frames per second, it doesn't make it more. It doesn't make the experience of the movie better. It means there's a sense. It feels like that's a false insertion of care, right? It's the duty of care to say, well, I could film it at a resolution you can never perceive. It feels like an artificial sense of the work. I'm not being very articulate, but that's kind of how I feel.
But let's pull it back to something specific in your work. I think it's in the opening phases of Soft Invasions. There's references to the 1942 Los Angeles UFO incident, where the war had begun, Pearl Harbor had happened, and there's that famous retouched photograph which pops up in Timothy Good's books and many other UFO books of the object which is caught
in the Klieg lights,
and the seizure searchlights, which was bombarded like mad from anti-aircraft guns from the ground. And that's the kind of starting point from Soft Invasions. And of course, knowing you as I did, when we worked together every day and reading your early work as it was developing towards publication, when you were writing Stalking Joan Crawford, which fed into that. That for me was, to read that was a wonderful moment, because I've always been fascinated, because all there is that one photograph and the newspaper archives, and that I think was what Mike Moorcock, he didn't say specifically, but he talked about the elegiac quality of what you were doing, and there's a Ballardian quality in the poolside scenes and what have you, but that was the beginning of the book, where you were sucked into this event which this event which happened, but maybe didn't happen as well. It's a mythological base. And I mean, so much of your work is work which is based upon reality or myths that expands outward. And the thing we're caught in, and we're still caught in it, and I mean, people don't realize it now. They think everything in the postmodern period is objective. We're still caught up in myth, aren't we? That's our central narrative, is the myth that we're able to build ourselves from modernism into where we are now.
I just read this really good biography of Kathy Acker by Jason McBride, and it reminds of the fact that she was, at a certain point in her career, not always, because sometimes she was tied to archetypal myth. Part of her project was to create a new myth. That the key scene in that book, that book tries to be historical fiction while also being essentially a psychological narrative. To the point where one of the criticisms of the book has been that, well, it's hard to describe without spoiling the narrative, but there's a point at which one of the doppelgangers is revealed to be not quite as close of a double as you might conceive, as might be reasonable. And then one of the things about that, I was recently reminded of it by Lawrence Rickles, who writes media theory, psychology, great work on the double as well. That he reminded me about the fact that in William Wilson, the protagonist is constantly trying to convince people that the double is actually the double. So sometimes the double is not quite the double. Sometimes the double is close enough to be psychologically real. But that, more to the point about myth, that book is essentially to the moment historical fiction, but the historical fictions in it are the irrational history, right? So the so-called Battle of Los Angeles that you refer to, and when the book began, the whole point of the book, that the metaphor that underpins the whole book, is that there was the point at which Burbank, the Lockheed terminal at Burbank, was covered over with camouflage. There was like acres of camouflage netting, artificial cars, artificial people, artificial homes, and so on, above the airport to stop any Japanese planes coming over, believing it was the airport and bombing it. So that was the central metaphor of the life beneath the camouflage. That was actually and if you imagine being, say, Japanese American in the early 40s, and thinking about Pearl Harbor has happened, you're waiting for internment to happen at any point. The double life seemed to be enacted across the whole city. And the idea that this was, the photo you refer to, where yeah, what is it? Is it a cloud? Is it a bomber? Is it a UFO?
A solid
it fits into all the mythologies of the era.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, you being an Englishman, an English writer, transposed to America, where you've lived for, how long is it since you moved?
Since 2009. So
yeah, so you've been in the States for 14 years.
Yeah.
And, you know, you've always been somebody who's been fascinated by American writing, American culture. And a book which you probably haven't read, I may be wrong, which I found when I read Soft Invasions, it kept intersecting with Soft Invasion of Mine, was with Jake Arnett's House of Rumour.
No, I haven't read
Have you read House of Rumour? And again, I mean, House of Rumour, it's not
a Jack Parsons novel.
Yes, the Jack Parsons novel. You know, and it's also the Aleister Crowley novel, it's the Ian Fleming novel, it's that thing, it's the Ovid novel, and it's that thing where, you know, it's mythology again in our lives. And it's interesting because next week, Monday morning, I'm flying off at 6 a.m. to a place which is profoundly mythological and at the same time profoundly modern, which is Capri, which is, it's really weird because I often say people went there on the grand tour in the Romantic era and they didn't. It wasn't discovered till long after that.
Right.
It was well into the 19th century.
Well, the Grand Tour's a myth. Right?
Yeah,
the Grand Tour is itself a myth.
Yeah,
that's the problem. I think, you know, one of the things that as writers we struggle with, I think, maybe, is that if you walk into a, you know, we live under the burden of things like the hero's journey and so on. For example, as the most blatant example, you know, that there's a lot of pressure to conform to the hero's journey. There's, you know, especially in terms of film, I would think it's probably even stronger. So there's obvious why a lot of films conform to that kind of, you know, the Campbell format, right? So, but yeah, myth is pervasive and it's powerful, and I definitely both love, in the sense of, you know, my Blake and my Jerusalem and all that kind of stuff, and also, you know, definitely I'm for better or worse, I'm completely influenced with Fraser, fertility cult stuff, but at the same time, you're always aware that it's an artifice.
It comes back to the old existentialist argument, doesn't it, of subjectivity as truth, which is attributed to Kierkegaard. And it is that thing. I mean, I'm an unashamed autobiographical writer, whatever I write, whether it's unpublished fiction or non-fiction, is that all writing, it seems to me, and I may be wrong, is autobiographical in that it reflects the concerns of the writer. So, you know, even in a very pure sense, even if you like Oscar Wilde, the whole idea that the writer does nothing with his own life and merely creates an image of beauty. It's an image that the writer wants to create, so it becomes an ultimate subjective thing. And, you know, that's a beautiful thing. And talking to John this morning, who is, you know, a supremely subjective writer who wants to get across his angle on things, and, you know, he's built an amazing sort of career about that. And that brings me back again to your work. And I mean, even in a book like Bombshell, which is really, I really felt the sort of power of the polemic in Bombshell. But because I know you, and because I know, you know, we've known each other a very long time, we know each other really well. Your personality was, for me, was entirely, the stain of it spread throughout that book, like when you dip watercolor into water and it just spreads out. But that's my take on it, and that's the beauty of it. That's the beauty of writing. It is that sort of third mind meeting of things, where my reading of you is going to be different to everybody else's because we know each other really well, you know, and the same with yourself. But that's what we need to get back to, and it seems to me now that what we're stuck in is this. It's all about markets. It seems to me that it's like, we know that publishing is about making money. We know businesses have to make money, but it seems to be very much that there's been this ongoing project from the dawn of the modern, and even though the modern is finished, it's still there, that we're talking about presenting work which is unique and subjective, will appeal to some and not all, and that the universal is a big question mark, and the universal is a fascinating topic for writing because our universal sense is born purely of, is it born purely of something genetic? Is it there? Is it questionable? Is it something extant and real? But this is where good writing of any kind, whether it's SF of any kind, really has to sort of pin itself to the board and say, I'm for this or I'm for that, and devil take the hindmost. And that's never been a problem for you in your writing.
I'm not answering that question, not deliberately, just because I was thinking of something. You said something earlier that sort of is provocative to me, which is, and I suspect I'm going to go on a pretty thick limb and suspect that you agree. I think that, for me, so okay, there are ways to categorize what I do, and it might be some sort of late modernism. I wasn't born, so I'm a late modernist, but I'm also a romantic. So my issue with a lot of the stuff that's in our contemporary arguments is that I do think, and I've always thought, that all arguments around because I'm a romantic, the death of the author is bollocks. Right? It's just a catastrophically, talk about Marsberg and space being aseptic, or Mailer saying that NASA has no smell. Like, those arguments about literature are asinine in terms of what it is actually to be a writer and a reader. The death of the author is such a rarefied academic premise.
Oh, absolutely.
But the consequences is that one of my current people tired of me talking about this is that I won't do the morality around this because it's too long-winded and there are too many different issues. But the arguments that we live within the scope of a generation that are the children of postmodern parents, right? So it's very easy for the children of postmodern parents who grew, even if they're not academic postmodernists, that some of that bullshit has consequences down the stream, So at the point at which there is a nihilism and there is a collapse, that is the consequence of postmodernity. So if you don't believe that authors are important, if you or worse, if you are an author who thinks, well, I'm an author, but I'm going to use ChatGPT to do my research to cover some of the work. This feels to me like collaboration with the enemy. It feels like handing
it is.
But you can only a part of the divide seems to me to be an age gap where which side of the death of the author you're on. Well, I'm on the side where the author's still very much alive. I'm still not strictly, but in my criticism, let's put it in crude terms. So forgive the ambiguity around the edges. If I'm a critic, I'll be a literary critic. I'm also still more Freudian than not. Right. I still believe that the psyche that created the work is important.
Well, it is
and the context of that psyche. So if you do the death of the author bullshit and just say, well, it's all just structuralism, it's all basically a repetition of what we were saying earlier. Feed the heroes, feed Campbell into a computer, and you've got every narrative you need, and there's only 8 narratives anyway. I find that to be pernicious.
It isn't reflective of reality, and interesting at the moment. Jim Burns, the great SF artist, who you're familiar with his work, he's been experimenting a lot with Midjourney, and he's been doing this on Facebook for probably about a year, and some people are critiquing that. And of course, Jim is an artist, but he's also a craftsman. He has a technical ability which allows him to...
He's putting in better terms.
He can create perfectly crafted ideas of what are essentially romantic vistas in his science fiction art. I mean, his covers for Robert Silverberg in the 80s are fantastic. And I mean, I go back, obviously on the channel I talk a lot about SF, and I talk about romanticism, and I talk about Frankenstein and cyberpunk. There's a video about that where actually really is the essence of the sublime. And again, I go back to the line, the one thing that Alfred North Whitehead said, it is the business of the future to be dangerous. And that is the essence of the sublime. It's not just the beauty, it's the terror. And that can only come out of a personal perception. It can't come out of a computer program. It can only come out of individual experience. So I guess that's where we're at. We're probably running out of time now. We've had a wonderful discussion. We've had several drinks. Your wife and your mum are downstairs. We should probably join them. Yeah.
I feel so rude.
Yeah, they've been letting us get on with it, with all our shit, and stuff. And they're both looking lovely down there. And we've pulled Alistair aside from going home. So it'll all come out in the edit. But this really is just it's quite nice to do something like this, because this morning when me and Mike were talking. And we had a certain set of questions. We talked about questions we were going to discuss. We freewheeled a bit, as one always does with Mike, but it's good to just sort of present the sort of thing that we have, that people I guess have in our conversations, and pretentiousness. Let's talk pretentiousness very briefly. As Eno and Bowie said, they'd invented a whole new school of pretension, and that was a good thing. That was a good thing.
I remember. Well, you were trying to sign off, so I just ruined it.
Yeah, no, but nonetheless, carry on. So we might have more footage.
The thing is, all right, I'm going to say this. You can do a sign off. Do a second sign off.
I'll do a second sign off.
I always thought that.
Yeah, we're all right. We've got a few minutes.
So,
good.
I mean, I remember reading when I was a kid. I don't think it was actually, believe it or not, leveled at me. I remember the word pretentious coming up, and I remember the key word with pretentious was at least in the dictionary definition in my 1970s, 80s dictionary, it involves an aspect of insincerity.
Yeah.
And people confuse...
It's pretending, isn't it? Yeah. But you're not pretending. That's the whole point.
And I think that's the thing. Is
none of us are pretending. That's the thing.
If you feel moved by it,
I got you riled up. I tell you.
Well, some people can think you're
people confuse
really
it.
pretentious.
Yeah,
but if it actually moves you, something to you.
I mean, if you want to talk
it's not pretense. It's it's real. It's a real thing. And as you see, you got me riled up.
If you're emotional about Zulus, it can't be pretentious, right?
Yeah, exactly.
If you feel like you want to have these French.
It's something I did recently on the channel. I talked about how. There's a line in the song "Touch and Go" by Magazine, and it's near the end of the song, and I think it's a funny thing, like when you're a kid, you buy records and you obsess with the details, and I know that "Touch and Go" is 2 minutes and 50 seconds long, and the final line in the song is "You take your pleasure seriously."
Yeah,
and that's always been a big thing.
No, that's a good line. That's a really good line.
And that was the essence.
That's the comeback to your pretentious.
You take your pleasure seriously. So we're going to sign up with that. Thanks very much to Alistair McNaughght and James Reich.
My God!
And
so many years. I can't even
that's the thing. And we will move on from that. And we're going to go downstairs now, and we're going to switch the camera off, and we'll have another pint. Bye for now, everybody.
You have to remember that I'm at sea level now, so I'm indestructible.